Welcome to Unlapped. Katie George, Nate Saunders, Laurence Edmondson. Nate is finally back. You've missed a couple of shows at this point. Fresh back from his travels to Austria, which certainly did not disappoint. And if you're listening to this, just know in about a matter of 5 hours or so, all the information could change if the FIA has anything to do with it. Obviously, that's a little tongue-in-cheek because the results of the Austrian Grand Prix did change for a couple of people. And Nate, I just want to get your overall thoughts. Laurence and I were on the ESPN post-race show. Unbeknownst to us that this was going to go down, that Aston Martin was going to submit an appeal. When did you find out about the protest? How did that all unfold on the ground?
Yeah, it was kind of a strange one because obviously, like everybody, we were monitoring the amount of track limit penalties there were during the race. And somebody did comment that towards the end of the race, it seemed like the frequency of those really really dropped down. We started to see less of them. The protest came through. I mean, we saw it when the document came through. Aston Martin's protested the result, and it was quite a vague statement that we got initially, and then they said, they're looking back at however many extra instances it was. And Laurence will remember this as well. I mean, Austria is a pretty funny location because it always seems to be the place where there's an FIA inquiry of some kind. I remember 2019, Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc, they kind of nearly came together on the final lap. Max basically barged Charles out of the way, and we spent, it must have been 4 or 5 hours sitting in that media center waiting. So when this email came through, for people, whose maybe geography of Austria is not too great, where Spielberg is, it's quite a long drive up to Vienna, which is where I was staying with, we always stay in the airport hotel. You fly back the next day. You're very conscious of the fact that you want to get out, and I thought to myself, this is going to take a long time. What we didn't factor for was we were leaving the same time all the Dutch fans were leaving, and we kind of caught the end of the traffic. So we got the email, the emails, as it turned out, with all of the verdicts in, as we were stuck in traffic. Fortunately, we were stationary at the time, so I was able to read it and relay it to the guys I was in the car with. But very strange and kind of a confusing one because at the time, I think the FIA, you could see how overwhelmed they had been by the whole thing because they weren't initially able to kind of provide information on how many instances they were looking at. And I think that the biggest disappointing thing was that it was quite obvious from Friday that track limits was going to be an issue. You could see it from the qualifying session. Max obviously spoke about it. Other drivers did. So by the time Sunday came about, it was quite a disappointing kind of sense of, this seemed like an inevitability that was going to happen. Maybe not in such an extreme way. But yeah, so when we left the circuit, we were none the wiser. And I think, obviously, and from what I understand, a few of the teams left Austria. They were on a chartered flight back. They landed to find all of the emails kind of stacked up in their inbox, saying penalty, investigation, penalty, and that in the team I spoke to anyway, one of their drivers had lost a few positions. So I think they were pretty miffed getting that. Probably a bit more surprised than I was reading them through on that on the I don't know if it's the autobahn in Austria. I don't know if they call it that, but the highway in Austria is where I finally found out.
I think miffed is a fair assertion here. Laurence, you were obviously at home, able to monitor it from start to finish after the race. What do you think the reaction from a lot of teams were? Some of them landing, as Nate said, getting the information firsthand when they touched down. How do you think they felt about the whole situation and how the FIA handled it?
I think everybody is pretty disappointed in how it all panned out. Clearly, it doesn't look great as a professional sport when everyone turns the TV off expecting to know the result, and about 5 hours later, you find out it's different. So yeah, I think there's a recognition that something has to change. It is fairly circuit specific. It's not like this is happening every weekend. We have had a number of instances where the FIA have taken a while to decide on stuff, but it's not usually track limits. And the reason was just the sheer volume. As Nate said, the sheer volume of things they had to check. They said there were 1,200 potential track limits violations. And if you calculate all the laps that 20 cars can do around Austria, it's something like 1,500. So over 71 laps. So, I mean, it was a crazy amount of stuff they had to go through, and they had to go through and they had to do each one correctly. And really what happened here is the FIA have created rod for their own back. They created this rule with track limits where they said, right, we're going to be super strict on it. It used to be the case that from circuit to circuit, corner to corner, they would have different rules in place, and you'd have to check the race director's notes to know what you could do, what you couldn't do. And then they basically had this blanket rule everywhere that if your four wheels are over the white line, then you're out of the track. And that's happened, I think it was 48 in the end they found additionally, which resulted in 12 new penalties across 8 drivers and a complete change of positions 4 down to 10 by the end of Sunday evening. So it's pretty crazy. I'm actually finishing off Succession. So I found out there was this investigation. I'd finished all my other work. I put Succession on, have my emails on loud just in case something happened. I think I got about 3/4 of the way through the episode before I had to kind of go back to my laptop.
Oh, the finale.
Preparing everything. Yeah, no, I was on the penultimate episode then. I have now watched the finale, but no spoilers, of course. No spoilers.
Yeah. I didn't realize that. I was talking to Laurence at the time. If I'd known that, I'd have taken it because Laurence very kindly picked up the work because obviously I was
stuck in a car.
Yeah, right. So if I'd known you were watching Succession, I'd have been like, dude, I'll take it. I had no idea.
Just left me on a little cliffhanger there, while I got my head around 12 different penalties. Yeah, so I don't know. Like something has to change. I was at Alpine today talking to Otmar Zafnauer, and he was quite clear that that you can't really have a situation like that. And I think what the FIA said is that they've talked to Spielberg a number of times, talked to Red Bull Ring and said, look, bring in a gravel trap there. They don't want to do that because it creates issues when you have motorcycles racing around there. It's quite dangerous to have a gravel trap in case they, go off into it in a big way. So it's a tricky balance, but something needs to be done, whether it's kind of more extreme curbing out there. But by next year, hopefully there'll be something in place and perhaps a better monitoring system for the FIA or just, or perhaps just those 2 corners. They slightly change the rules so that it's there's a bit more flexibility, which is how it used to be.
Spielberg's got a full year to ultimately decide what changes they're going to make, if any at all, because the Austrian Grand Prix keeps the same exact weekend, June 28th through the 30th in 2024. Ask me how I know that, because the 2024 calendar was released today. Woo, woo. Let's get into it, shall we? Because holy smokes, 24 races on the calendar from February 29th. So does that mean that it's a leap year again? Is that correct?
It does.
February 29th? Okay, good deal.
Yeah, that's I wouldn't have clocked that.
Yeah, the only reason I know that is because I have a nephew born on leap year. So he's a February 29th. I digress. February 29th all the way to December 8th in Abu Dhabi. What do you make of this long calendar, and are you guys going to be able to handle it yourself as Globetrotters?
It's pretty. The first time I saw it, I was kind of like, I just thought, wow, because from a human point of view, there's a lot. There's a lot to it. What I will say from the beginning is that I think F1, you can see they're clearly trying to make it as geographically logical as they can. They're moving things around where they can. So Japan has moved up. It's taken kind of Baku's spot, and Baku's kind of gone down. Is now there with Singapore. But I mean, Australia, Japan, China, all standalone races. So everyone flies in, flies back to the UK or to Europe. I think, and then to end on 3 triple headers that span over, multiple continents. It's from a human perspective, I think that's going to be the main thing. I was kind of looking at it and I think, I'm lucky I don't go to every single race, but for a lot of the mechanics, a lot of the guys that do that, I think this will be a long, long time on the road. So that side of it's interesting, but I think what Formula One's moving towards is they want to have hubs in a lot of these areas where they can, teams can take their freight to. And so, you have 4 or 5 weeks where a bunch of races are kind of, I guess, in one area, or at least in one continent. They're not there perfectly yet. And actually, I think they wanted a few races that haven't moved on the 2024 calendar to have moved into some gaps. If you actually look, there's some gaps there. I think they wanted Vegas to move up, and I think that they created that space that's after Singapore and before Austin. There's a gap there, and I think that was ready-made for Vegas, and they didn't want it. So there's a lot of that going on, behind the scenes. Some circuits want to go in some places, but yeah, looking at it, it's pretty crazy. It's a long, long season, and as we're seeing this year, I think the danger for Formula One is if Max and Red Bull are dominating again, it's a long, long time to have that be the case, which is always my big concern with the big calendar. Not just the human cost of it, but the saturation point. You can reach that quite quickly. So we'll see. But I mean, it's great to see. I mean, it's good to see that, for example, Belgium, is staying around. We don't know how long that's going to be. But you're never sure when these calendars come out, with how many years some of these famous races have. So pleased to see that back. And yeah, I think Laurence will end up doing more than me anyway. So, and Laurence is probably now going to say that he's going to love it. And I'm looking forward to it. I've already asked Laurence if I can do Japan next year, which is one I haven't done. So we'll see how that goes. Keep coming back to listen. I think one of us is going to do Australia. One of us will do Japan as it stands, maybe.
Where do you fall today, Laurence? Will you allow him to go to Japan or to be determined?
It is one of the best races on the calendar, so maybe we'll just have to leave it in our boss's hands. And
yeah,
it is an interesting start to the year, isn't it? Also, first two races on a Saturday, which is unusual. Okay, we're going to get that for Las Vegas later this year, but then Bahrain and Saudi Arabia on a Saturday, and that's because Ramadan starts the Sunday after the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix in the evening. So there was obviously cultural sensitivities there. They didn't want to race during Ramadan, so they've moved those races earlier. So we're starting. That's why the first practice day in Bahrain is on February 29th, because they have been shifted that bit earlier. And then that's why you've got two races on a Saturday. It kind of works because in the Middle East, the weekend tends to be Friday, Saturday, rather than Saturday, Sunday, like we have in a lot of the other parts of the world. So I think that kind of works. But it's a strange one. And like these big gaps between Australia, Japan, China, we used to get a little bit of that with races early in the year, sometimes between Australia and Malaysia. And actually what some of the teams would do is offer their mechanics and people that had to be at every race to go on holiday in between. So they would pick, I don't know, Langkawi in Malaysia and say, well, rather than go home, we will pay for you to have a holiday here for about 5-6 days, and then they go off to the next track and start setting up. So I don't know whether some teams will be able to take advantage of that, but of course, not everyone is in a position where they want to be taking holidays in between. People have families to go back to and the rest of it. And also engineers in particular, engineers do tend to fly back either the night of the race, if it's in Europe, or the next day, and they want to get back and get to work immediately in the office back at the factory. So it's a logistically tricky one in some senses, but I think the clumping of races together does make some sense. The one that still sticks out a little bit oddly is Canada, which is still in the middle of the European season. But of course, Canada is not a kind of place where you can race too early in the year or too late in the year, because it gets very cold and conditions might not allow it. So there's some logic to bits of it. There's other bits which I think still need to be ironed out. But 24 races. I mean, we had that scheduled this year. Of course, China got knocked off very early on, and then we lost Imola as well. So we're down to 22, but 24 races is a lot of racing in one year.
The back-to-back Saturday races to open, and then obviously you said Vegas as well, is an interesting note. Nate, do you foresee more Saturday races becoming popular in the future?
Yeah, I can. And I think, to be honest as well, and it does make sense from Ramadan, but also in the Middle East, the weekend is Friday, Saturday. So we often see it when we go to a lot of races in the Middle East, you'll see that Friday and Saturday, you see a lot of people who aren't at work, and then Sunday you notice it's a lot quieter. People have gone into work and stuff like that. So it'll be interesting to see. And Formula One has made a big point of saying we want to lean into local cultures as much as we can, and I feel like that's one way to do it. And it's interesting because I think Sundays have always just kind of been set in stone for Formula One. It's always been Sunday is a race day, and you might look at it, and obviously, as you mentioned, Vegas is doing Saturday. I'm still really curious about that, just generally that concept. And I think that the success or failure of Vegas in that slot will actually determine whether we see more of that going forward. I'm not sure if any European races would do Saturdays, because I think obviously on the flip side for what I said about the Middle Eastern races, if you have a race on Saturday, you're going to qualify Friday. Now, F1's okay doing that for a sprint weekend, but you have the payoff of having the sprint quali and the sprint race on the Saturday in that case. So I think we'll see. But I think Formula One, under Liberty, have shown us that they're basically not afraid to try any of these new things out. Whether it's a sprint race, whether it's a race on Saturday, all these things they're willing to try. So I can see it happening. But I think I heard one person in the paddock, and this was just somebody who was kind of spitballing the idea, but was like, why don't we just have a midweek race one time? I think that's a bit extreme, but I think Saturday is definitely something you could foresee happening.
Laurence, you had mentioned China, and I know Joe Granu and his fans back home are going to be thrilled to see that on the 5th race on the calendar, April 19th through the 21st. You've been to the Chinese Grand Prix. How would you describe it, since obviously we're missing that entity this year?
Yeah, so last one I went to was the last one in 2019, and Joe wasn't on the grid, so it will be his debut home race. It's an unusual race, just because it's a very different culture out there. It says it's on the Shanghai International Circuit. It's actually quite a long way out of Shanghai, but it is also the last stop on a metro station, so you can get out there quite easily. And my main memories from it is some incredibly enthusiastic fans, like really quite hardcore, especially Kimi Räikkönen and Valtteri Bottas fans. I don't know why they love the Finns so much, but yeah, when Kimi was racing in F1, they went pretty wild for him. So yeah, it's something slightly different, and it's actually a pretty cool track in terms of the layout. It's one of the Hermann Tilke design ones. It's got a pretty cool first corner that kind of bends round in on itself and then flips back the other way. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see if we get back there. Of course, we haven't been there because of the pandemic since 2019. Although by the time we got around to the actual date that it was meant to be this year, a lot of the pandemic regulations had lifted. So there's also questions about whether there are political reasons that F1 doesn't want to go back racing there. But it is on the calendar. By the looks of it, we're going there. And yeah, I mean, at least, yeah, Joe will be happy and his fans will be happy too.
Do either of you think at some point when we're sitting at, Christmas, right, of 2024, we look back and think this was way too much in one calendar year? Or do you think that this becomes the new norm moving forward?
Well, I think both, to be honest with you, Katie. I think we will think it's too much, but I think it's going to become the new normal. I think it's been clear for a while Formula One's wanting to pack the calendar out. And currently in the regulations, if I'm right in saying it's 24 is the maximum amount allowed. But obviously that can change the next time they come to do that. So there's so much interest right now in Formula One to host a race that, adding races to the calendar at this point is easy for Formula One. I think, if you went back 10 years, maybe you could have found one or two races that were really interested. Now you have all these places doing it. But I've always felt that, 2021 is kind of the ideal, and even then, I can remember when the first time they said 21 races, it seemed like a lot. Then it was like, wow, that's a lot of races. So if every year you're adding one, or every 2 years you add one race, before you know it, you've added 5 over 10 years or whatever it is. So I think it is too much. I think we will be looking back to that. But sadly, I think that's just, we're never going to go back to a 16 race calendar anytime soon, which was kind of the, how it was about 15 years ago. So yeah, I think it's until these rules change, I think 24, 25 will be where we're at.
Well, if you got Silverstone tickets for this upcoming weekend, just know you can buy in advance because that date is the exact same on the 2024 calendar. Silverstone, I always find absolutely fascinating and iconic. I spoke too soon for Laurence, Nate, when we were on the ESPN post-race show. I said, I assume it's one of your favorite circuits. And he's like, not so much. So I'd ask you, Nate, what you think of Silverstone. And then do drivers tend to agree with Laurence, or is this one of their favorite circuits on the calendar?
Well, it's a difficult one because in terms of getting to Silverstone, even if you live in England, it's an absolute nightmare. It's like there's like 2 roads basically that can go in and out. Traffic's terrible. I actually like it. I like that, and I think I've been lucky that I've always covered it at a time when Lewis Hamilton, has been at the front end of the grid, and that's made a huge difference. It's like it would be like in 10 years' time if somebody does a Zandvoort Grand Prix and Max isn't competitive and Max isn't even there. I think it will be a lot different to how it is doing a Zandvoort GP right now. The crowd is always fantastic, and I hate going to races where there's not really much buzz, and Silverstone there's always a buzz. And I think once you get through all of the nonsense of the traffic and getting into it, it's just a great circuit. I'm a big fan, and I think the fact that drivers tend to like it from what I know. I think that obviously it's got the history of the history element to it. It's the first ever F1 race was held there. First ever World Championship race was held there. So yeah, I think I'm pretty sure they're like it's a driver favorite. I'm not sure if there's any I can think of that don't like it. Maybe any of the guys that haven't won the race might not like it, but I know Lewis does, and I think it's one of those circuits that people kind of they liken it to. Maybe not a karting track in the same way that like the Hungaroring is, but I think it's got a lot of corners that drivers just love going to. This very, very challenging circuit, quick. There's got some. I think it's got some of the most iconic bits of racetrack in the world. So, yeah, I like it, and I'll try and convince Laurence otherwise when we're there at the weekend.
Yeah, please do, because you're bunking with each other over the weekend. Is that correct?
Yeah, not quite bunking, but
Separate
house
rooms, but same
house
house.
sharing. Yeah. I mean, I'd happily bunk. I've not bunked with anyone for a long time since I was hosteling with people.
Lauren's like, let's not talk.
I just said the record straight as well. Like, it's a great circuit. It is a
Mm-hmm.
fantastic circuit. It's just some of the things that go along with it. I think it's since they changed the paddock. So, I mean, we're going back a long way now to 2011 was when they changed where the paddock was from its original location to where it is now. And I used to really like the old paddock. I think, it was okay. It had its issues as well, but it just felt like, it felt like the center of the circuit. It felt properly connected to the rest of the circuit. Now you have to get a double-decker London bus to get from the car park.
I love that.
To the paddock. Yeah, well, okay, but it's really frustrating. It disconnects you from everything. So if you're in the paddock and you just want to go and watch trackside, you're looking at a kind of a 20-30 minute ride across, and it's mainly because when they came up with the plans and they had these plans to build a tunnel under the circuit and there was going to be a bridge somewhere else, and essentially at that stage they ran out of money to do those extra little bits, and they never really got around to finishing it off. There is now a bridge that goes across from the paddock to the hotel on the other side, but I'm not sure if we can use it. Last time I checked, we couldn't. So it's just frustrating little things like that. And I think it's also that thing of it's a home race. I've been there so many times that you feel like you can be a bit harsh on it. But the circuit itself is fantastic, and absolutely the drivers love it. A number of corners that they love, but especially Maggots Beckett's Chapel, which is this series of high speed sweeping corners that go from one to another. And in a Formula One car, they are like almost really nothing else on the calendar. It's a bit like Austin, the S's there at Austin, but this is like the original version, and it is that little bit more impressive. And also, if you watch their trackside, if you can get the bus over from the paddock to go and watch their trackside, or even better, just get a ticket and be there all weekend, seeing the cars change direction through there is sensational, and unlike pretty much anywhere else on the F1 calendar. So yeah, look, it is a great track. It just has a few issues, which when you are going back there for the Xth time, it gets a bit frustrating.
Laurence is jaded, is what he's saying.
Yeah, essentially.
Sounds like it, doesn't it?
I'm just trying to think how many times I've been now, but it's much less than Laurence. I've probably been 6 or 7 times. I totally get those things, but I mean, what I will say about the circuit as well. I mean, last year, when you have a circuit that's packed, when it's a great race, you can really tell it's a great race. And last year was so good. Mm-hmm. And where we are in the media center, you're right opposite, the main grandstand. And just the noise, the whole race, because people were overtaking each other. You had that. It's become a bit of a meme now, where Perez and I think it's Leclerc run wide, and David Croft goes, and through goes Hamilton. At the time, I remember I was like, "This is some of the best racing I've ever seen," and I don't think it would have. There's not a lot of circuits where a race that good, in my opinion, would happen. I think Silverstone's just got a lot of things you'd want. So some good memories. Let's hope they can. I mean, F1 kind of probably needs it to be a repeat this year in terms of just how dramatic. And if Max Verstappen gets something stuck under his car this year, that would also be quite helpful. I think that would. I don't think there'd be many people other than Max and maybe Christian Horner who wouldn't want to see that.
But as brilliant as Max has been, you guys just sold why you should watch this race, damn it. So well done. I appreciate that very much. I will say there's a song, and I'm not going to sing it here. Rain, rain, go away. It feels like rain has been here to stay with all of these races in the past few weeks. And I'm not going to complain about it because it's made for some really interesting moments throughout the entirety of the weekend. Laurence, based on the circuit that you described before us, how does rain impact a weekend at Silverstone?
I think rain makes pretty much any F1 weekend better, but Silverstone especially, and it just seems like part of Silverstone in general. Occasionally we'll get a weekend where it'll be really hot and you have 3 perfect days of sunshine, but we're probably talking 1 in every 6 or 7 British Grand Prix. So there's usually a bit of rain in the air. So I'm looking out the window right now. I'm kind of about 30 minutes away from the track, and it's looking a bit cloudy. There was a bit of rain earlier today. I came up on my motorbike and nearly got caught in it. So it's always there. There's always a potential. And look, if it happens, I think it will only make it more exciting. We've had some really good wet races here. My mind immediately goes back to 2008 and Lewis Hamilton's amazing victory there. Won by miles, but it was quite incredible at the time, and that was in a really competitive season as well. Meanwhile, Felipe Massa, who was his title contender, was spinning around and kind of going through the grass and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, I think there's a lot of potential for it to be a great race, because it's already a really really is a driver's circuit, one where, you know, drivers need to really be very brave and commit. And then when you add water to that as well, then you really see the difference between the very top drivers and the rest of them.
I had a hard time listening after you said motorbike. Did you say motorbike?
I did say motorbike. Yeah.
I did not have that on my bingo card. I'm not going to lie. Now I'm picturing Laurence riding his motorbike through the countryside. Lovely. Nate, have you ever ridden it with him?
I have not. He's not invited me on yet. I haven't been able to do that. In fact, I don't think I've ever ridden. I've ridden on a motorbike once with someone, but I can't ride myself. So maybe we'll do that after on Sunday. We'll ride back to Saturday. We'll ride back to where we're staying together.
Okay, perfect.
I'll bring
pictures if that happens.
Yeah, no, thanks, Katie, because I was too scared to ask him myself. So now you've done it.
Perfect. Yeah, I've opened the door for you. As it pertains to Red Bull at this track, only 3 drivers have won 5 consecutive races, being Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton, and Michael Schumacher. Sebastian Vettel holds the record for 9 consecutive races. Nate, do you foresee Max making another step towards Vettel's record in Silverstone? It's like I asked this question, and it's like I asked the question.
Yeah, I mean, it was already quite difficult to say no, wasn't it? But I think it's becoming more and more obvious that that's where it's going. But then again, we spoke to Christian Horner about this on Sunday, and Horner is very much, every time he gets the chance, he downplays the idea of this unbeaten season, and he pointed to last year's race. I mentioned it. Max last year, was in a really strong position and got some debris stuck under his car, and it ruined his race. And if you remember, he spent the rest of that race battling Mick Schumacher for, I think, 9th position, and which was probably one of the few times in this kind of era of F1 we're ever going to see Max fighting for that kind of position. So it can happen, and especially as Laurence mentioned, if it rains, it always throws that jeopardy in there. The problem with Max, and I don't mean the problem with Max, but the problem from a competitive standpoint, is Max right now is just he's driving so well. You feel like every week it just seems like his level gets better. You think, okay, we feel like you've seen the best of him, and then he just pulls out more from, and suddenly the elements, how they might affect other drivers, don't seem to affect him in the same way. We saw 2 races at the weekend where he was just in complete control, and it's remarkable. So I would at this point put money on him. Yeah, definitely getting the 6th. And Vettel's record, if you look at the races coming up, I mean, they're all very, very winnable races for Max, and we've not seen any suggestion from him or from Red Bull. We haven't seen any issues with the car or anything like that might suggest that he's not going to get that. So yeah, my money would definitely be on Verstappen winning. And now I've said that, I tried to say that a few times so that hopefully I'll put the commentator's curse on it, but I don't know if I've done that or not. But yeah, hopefully, just for the sake of the season, I think it, obviously if Max doesn't win, it's great. But I kind of also, I think the longer Max wins, the more I'm kind of actually intrigued to see him keep winning and see how many, like if he can extend that record out. Let's say he does get 9. Could he extend it to 10? Could he do 11, 12, 13? So it's quite an interesting one at the moment. And it's just basically Max Verstappen's world, isn't it, at the moment? And we're just all kind of watching it.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Austria was his 7th win of the 2023 season.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. So Laurence, with that in hand, what would you place the over under of Max Verstappen wins this year?
So what was his record he set last year? Was it 14? Was that
we had 15.
Okay, so he's going to go, I'm going to say beyond that. So Checo already has 22 races. Let's go with 17.
17. Unbelievable. You mentioned Checo Perez, and he's had his fair share of struggles over the last month or two. Struggled again for part of the weekend in Austria before landing on the podium on Sunday. Laurence, just how would you describe what we've seen from Checo of late?
I think it's a guy under a huge amount of pressure and someone who's not really dealing with it that well. The qualifying record of what happened in Monaco and then Spain and then Canada and then Austria, 4 qualifyings in a row, not making Q3 in the fastest car. And there were bits of luck that came into it. There's some things that went against him. Weather went against him on occasion. Obviously track limits in Austria, but you don't see Max finding himself in the same situation. When Max knows he's got to deliver on a single lap because that's all he's got because the weather's coming in, he does it. Or when he's told you need track limits, you need to keep it between the lines, he does it. So I think it's this guy under massive pressure, and I think a guy realizing that another shot at the title, which is what he had this year, it's slipping away from him, and that's going to be pretty hard to take.
Did you get any sense, Nate, from Christian Horner of how he currently views Checo and what kind of future he possibly has at Red Bull?
It's hard to tell because everyone you talk to at Red Bull still says that, Checo's there for the duration of his contract, which runs until the end of next season. But you can see the frustration is starting to build. And especially when we spoke to Christian on Sunday, he said, obviously that was after the podium performance that you mentioned, Katie, but the frustration was still there because it was this car should have been up here anyway. He shouldn't have had to fight through the field in the sprint race. He shouldn't have had to sorry, not in the sprint race, in the race itself. He shouldn't have been in that situation in the first place. And I think we've said it before, haven't we, that if Red Bull had a closer challenger this year, I really think the pressure would be higher because you could potentially be opening the door to a rival. Perez is very, very lucky that at the moment Red Bull's so far ahead, basically have the Constructors' Championship. It would take a lot for that not to happen at this point. So I think that that's a big factor as well. And I think that Red Bull have made changes before, and obviously they ended up in the situation where they went outside of the driver market to get, their driver academy to get Perez. I think what will be interesting is once we've seen Ricciardo is testing next week in Silverstone, that might change things. If Ricciardo tests and is very, very impressive, I think that we've talked about it before. He's leaning towards that AlphaTauri seat. But at the moment, Perez seems very, very safe, for Red Bull anyway. You never know if Helmut Marko is going to wake up one day and just say, actually, I want to change things up. But yeah, I think he's looking okay for now. But I think that the longer this goes on, and I think that podium was so key because if he'd gone another race, another cycle of races without scoring a podium, I think that pressure really does start to mount. So if he can because all Perez has got to do really is stay out of trouble, and he should challenge for a podium every weekend. And if you're Red Bull and he's not doing that, you suddenly look around and you say, well, there's lots of other drivers here who could do that. I don't think they're expecting him to beat Max at this point. I think they're just expecting him to be competitive. And but no sense currently that they've lost patience with him. But I think, the early signs of that were there earlier in the weekend in Austria.
Yeah, it's really been an interesting kind of underlying story to follow as Red Bull has had this remarkable season so far. You mentioned one of the rivals to Red Bull, and I put quotes because there's not many of those as it pertains to the 2023 season, but Mercedes had a pretty poor performance, Laurence, in Austria. They'll obviously be looking to bounce back in their home race. Did you feel like the Austrian Grand Prix was an anomaly, or did we get too excited too soon as it pertains to Mercedes and some of the upgrades that they brought?
I think it's a bit of both. So it is an anomaly in that I think it's always been a circuit they've struggled at. If you just look at the point standings, it was the round they scored the least points at this year. But the upgrade that they brought was in Monaco. So the fact that all the other teams, all their rivals have brought fairly big upgrades since then means that it's balanced back out. So they took a big step in Monaco, and over time, their rivals have chipped away at it, and Red Bull all the time have maintained their advantage. There's another big upgrade coming to the Mercedes this weekend. So I think once again, we'll see the Mercedes leap forward again. It's also a circuit which they are really expecting to do well at. It's like right at the top of their list. They have this list of circuits where they expect to do very well, the car will suit, and circuits where they really don't expect it to suit. And Silverstone's right near the top. Austria actually wasn't too far down that list, so they were a bit disappointed with last weekend. But yeah, Silverstone, they look at the similarities to Barcelona's Spanish Grand Prix, where they had one of their best results of the year. And I think, yeah, there's a lot riding on it. But apparently this performance upgrade is big again. The one in Monaco kind of set them on the right path. They have since found performance from that platform they're now bringing to the car, which will ultimately all feed into hopefully for them, or what they intend to do, make a championship contending car next year. So these are meant to be big steps, and if they're not big steps, that's when we need to start to worry. But I think the blip of Austria, if it's corrected with a podium in Silverstone, or certainly the performance being there at Silverstone, they won't be too worried about it, overall. But yeah, if an upgrade comes and they don't get the performance they're expecting, it doesn't deliver what they've been told in their wind tunnel and their CFD, that's when they need to start worrying. But so far that hasn't happened. It's just the nature of that very tight pack behind Red Bull, with teams bringing upgrades every race and leapfrogging each other.
I know we root for parity, but I have to say one of my favorite radio messages of the season was Toto Wolff coming on to Lewis and saying, "We know the car is bad. Please drive it." I loved that line. I don't know why, but I love that line. And partly it's because I'm infatuated by Toto's accent and all that he says.
Yeah, he does have the perfect, like, kind of, not, I wouldn't even say bad guy, but just that accent. I've watched too many Arnie movies. It's made for TV.
Yes, it truly is.
Yeah. Can you do your impression again, Katie?
No, I will not.
Just so we can roast you for it.
We went through and it wasn't my best work, but
okay. Well,
we're gonna move on.
Next week we'll make it a segment. I feel like
okay.
Katie doing Toto impressions.
Hopefully it's a better radio message this time around that I can impersonate.
Yeah. Him congratulating Lewis on winning a race at Silverstone would be pretty mega.
Yeah, that would be something. Wanted to ask you about your friends, Nate, because McLaren took a huge step forward in Austria. Lando Norris finished fourth after the penalties, of course, but showed great pace all weekend. They're expected to bring more upgrades to Silverstone. Do you feel like they're finally starting to click on all cylinders after a pretty slow start?
I think it's too early to say. They've made a global improvement in terms of generally speaking. And I think, to be honest with you, what Laurence just said about Mercedes, you can almost flip around a little bit with McLaren. If you look at McLaren's form at Austria, Lando especially has always been super, super strong there. Their car just seems to suit that place. I went to McLaren on Monday, and Zach Brown said it was a great result, but we're a long way away from feeling like we can do that every week. But given where McLaren started, I think that any progress is good, and I think they have made a good step with that. I don't want it to sound like I'm saying, they're still stuck where they were, a month or two ago. But I think that Austria and just how well Lando was driving that weekend probably propelled them up the grid a little bit. Are they going to be ahead of an Aston and ahead of a Mercedes every week? I don't think that's going to be the case, and certainly for the not for the foreseeable future. But the fact that they're now in that mix, I think Zach Brown feels pretty confident that they can fight up there with Alpine pretty regularly, which a few months ago we wouldn't have predicted at all. So definite step forward. Lando was asked, will he be the top Brit on the podium? At Silverstone, and he was like, well, it's basically us v Mercedes, isn't it? Because the other two guys are there. And then he basically looked at the journalist who asked the question and kind of shook his head with a smile on his face and was like, I'd love to be, but it looks unlikely. But we'll see. I think that what McLaren like at the moment is that both their drivers seem to be getting the most out of the package, and obviously last year that wasn't the case. And I think one of the big questions last year was how many extra points could we have got had Ricciardo been performing in that other car. So I know Piastri isn't getting points every week, but I think that they feel like his performance levels are where they want them to be. And obviously he didn't have the upgrade in Austria. He's getting the upgrade this week, I believe. So it's quite remarkable to see that the morale at that team seems to be still in a good place, despite everything we've talked about with just where they were at the start of the year and kind of where they are generally, because they're still not really where they wanted to be. McLaren should be at the front competing for titles, not patting themselves on the back for being a midfield team.
To that point, I have to imagine Lando Norris early on, Laurence was frustrated with how things were going and the lack of pace. Do you feel like this kind of progress, I don't know if appease is the right word, but does this kind of progress help with Lando Norris's future at McLaren?
Definitely, but it has to be sustained and really it has to be better than it has been so far, because I mean, it's all well and good saying, they made this great step in Austria, but by their own admission, they launched the car and they said, we know we're not going to be where we want to be in the midfield. We know we're not going to be competitive. Then an upgrade came in Baku, which is really where the car should have started the season 4 races in. And then this latest upgrade came in Austria, and really that should have been once they got away from the first few flyaway races. So it's still behind expectations within McLaren, and I think a long way behind expectations for Norris. Of course, with Lando, the other question is what else is available at any one time? Where else can he go? And I still think that if a really serious offer was put on the table to him and he has a way to get out of that McLaren contract, the way things are stacked up right now, you'd probably take it. Because if you look at the long-term prospects at McLaren, okay, yes, there's some steps forward. They've got the wind tunnel coming in, which they claim is going to make their own brand new wind tunnel coming in, which they claim is going to make a big step forward essentially next year and then the year after. But you look around at some of the rivals, and you've got Aston Martin making this huge step without their new wind tunnel online yet, and without the new factory which has just opened. They did all of that last year anyway with just getting the right people on board. You look at obviously Red Bull being so far ahead, you look at the quality at Mercedes, the kind of the potential at Ferrari and the romance of driving for Ferrari. Then you even look at, say, Alfa Romeo, which is going to become Audi in 2025. 2026, even 2026 when they actually become Audi. And you think, well, that those are some really good prospects, because a team like Audi, they're going to have their own in-house engines coming in, building around the chassis. So I still think McLaren have to do an awful lot to prove Lando long term that it's the right place to be. But of course, you've got to start somewhere. So this step, which we should also say isn't the full upgrade package they had in Austria. There's still bits to come to it. And as Nate said, it's going to be on Oscar's car as well this weekend. It is very important. But I think they really have to do something long term as well to prove to Lando that it's the right place to be.
No doubt about it. You mentioned Ferrari, and I'd like to pivot our conversation there. A good result overall for Ferrari. They seem to get a grip on strategy and their race pace in Austria. Charles Leclerc on the podium, P2. Carlos Sainz, after being penalized from Aston Martin's protest 5 hours later, he dropped down to sixth place, but still a decent amount of points for Ferrari. Nate, do we feel like Ferrari can contend with Red Bulls in Silverstone?
It's a good question. I think you're right to say that the strategy for the last two races, Canada and Austria, obviously in qualifying in Canada, we were kind of questioning the decision, but there has seemingly been a bit of a step in terms of the calls seem a bit less erratic. It seems like there's a bit more confidence internally in that, and I think that makes a big difference. If Ferrari are going into races and they know that they can call the right things, I think that does make a difference. Whether they can be the closest challenger to Red Bull, I think that's all relative. But at certain races, they're turning up at the moment. I mean, they've got such a quick qualifying car. I mean, Charles Leclerc was so close in qualifying to getting Max. Really, really awesome lap, actually, from Charles. If you actually go and watch the onboard, just how much he was pushing it at the end of qualifying on the Friday. So, yeah, I think they'll be up there. But again, it's difficult. It's so difficult to call at the moment, that gap, that group behind Red Bull. Because we see it, don't we? We've got Aston, Ferrari, Mercedes. Then the next week, Aston and Mercedes can drop away. Ferrari can come back up again. So I think that Ferrari are in a good spot, and I think Charles, especially at the moment, seems to be finding his groove in terms of how he's driving, how he's racing. And I always feel like a happy Charles Leclerc is a Charles Leclerc who's in form, and that's never a bad thing. So yeah, I think all the signs are there that they're going to have maybe not a race-winning weekend, but definitely a strong one. When
you look at the year in total, who do you feel like's driven better, Laurence, Sainz or Leclerc?
I think it's the same old story there in that. Well, I think Leclerc is ultimately the better driver, the faster driver. He's had a lot of bad luck and things go wrong this year and made some mistakes. But I'd still say Leclerc is the better of the two drivers there. And of course, when they've had a chance to get podiums, which is Baku and Austria, they're the only podiums they've had this year. He's been the one that's taken them. So I think Leclerc, still remains the team leader there, and also the guy that I think the whole team really feels like it needs to impress and work hard to keep. Whereas it sounds like Carlos is already working on a new contract, where Charles seems to be keeping his options a little bit more open because he wants to know what he can do when his contract expires at the end of next year, I believe. So yeah, it's a funny dynamic there, but they do seem to be making progress both with the car. Again, this situation. Let's go back to launches again. I remember going to Maranello and them talking about, well, of course, we're going to be fighting for a championship. We are Ferrari. That's what we do. That's why we exist in Formula One. And they are, couldn't really be further away when you look at, the championship and who's ahead of them, Aston Martin and Mercedes. Like, no one expected Ferrari to have, three teams ahead of them at this stage of the season. So it's still not quite good enough, but I think it is starting to come together. And back to that point Nate made about the strategy, they did make some big changes in the strategy department. They got rid of Inaki Rueda at the top of it, and I think he got put into a different position, but he got taken off the pit wall making decisions straight away. But there was also a huge amount of work that went on behind the scenes. It was redeveloping a lot of the software and the systems and the mechanisms by which they make decisions, and kind of looking at why they were making the wrong decisions, not just the guy putting the finger on the button. All the systems that go into developing that decision on the pit wall. They've had to go back through those and kind of redefine them and find new ways of working. And inevitably, that's going to take time. I think it's good to see those kind of things click, because as soon as they do get a competitive car like they had at the start of last year, any mistake like that is just devastating, as we saw at the start of last year with the mistakes they made.
As it pertains to other teams on the grid that we haven't spoken in depth about, Aston Martin finished 5th and 9th in Austria, a weekend where they looked a bit off the pace, I think is fair to say. Williams, both their drivers finished strong in Austria. They seem to be in a good place. Specifically, Alex Albon seems to be in a really good place. You could say that Haas, AlphaTauri, Alfa Romeo need to bounce back at Silverstone. What are some of the underlying storylines that you guys will be following this weekend from other teams on the grid?
Well, one that I think is quite interesting to look at, and we've seen it at 2 races now, where for most of the season, the story at Aston Martin was that Fernando Alonso was getting all the points and Stroll was struggling. At 2 races, Spain, and then at the weekend, Stroll actually turned in a really, really solid performance and finished ahead of Fernando, which is interesting because I don't think any of us would put the 2 of them in the same conversation when it comes to driving. But the one thing that was always key for Aston, and especially if they're kind of slipping away from that position, is they've got to be scoring well with both teams. And it's interesting because Stroll clearly, I asked him in Canada if he needed to start beating Alonso more, and he gave me kind of, a very, very stern look, but gave me an answer of like, yeah, I do need to improve. I need to do that. I'm not set, part of me does think as well, like we spoke to Fernando on Sunday and he'd sat behind Lance for the whole race. Part of me wonders, did Fernando just sit there and think, look, I'm going to push this kid as far as I can, and try and get the best out of him. I don't know whether that's going on in his head, but that, people at Aston, if you talk to them, they'll say that if you look at Spain and you look at Austria, they say that's the Lance Stroll that they think they can get all season. Now, I'm not convinced of that myself, but I think from their point of view, it'd be great if he can keep doing that. He doesn't have to beat Fernando every week. I don't think he's going to do that, but just getting the most out of the car as we've started to see him doing, I think would be good. And I'm trying to remember if Lance ended up losing any points or positions with the penalties. It's all gone. My brain's gone too much.
I think he jumped up, didn't he?
So slight correction. Yeah, it was. I think you're thinking of the sprint where.
I am thinking of the sprint. I just remembered suddenly that he was lower than Alonso in the race, but in the sprint,
and in the race, it went Alonso's way. Alonso eventually finished 5th. I think he got a position.
That's
because
right.
Because of the penalties, and I think Lance also got a position from 10th to 9th. But it's interesting that one way where Alonso was behind him because he looked like he was fast enough to make a move. But then you've got to remember there's a number of things going on here. One, they're teammates, and at the moment, Alonso doesn't need to rock the boat. I think everyone accepts that he is the better driver of the 2. But also, because of the way the sprint points are handed out, there's only 1 point on offer. Is it really worth a gamble in mixed conditions? They were both on aging lines as well. Do you go for it? So, that's an interesting one. I'm actually quite excited about Aston Martin because I'm going to their factory tomorrow evening. They've invited all the media, pretty much, it seems, to go and have a look around it. And last time I saw it, it was a building site. So it'll be interesting to see what they've got there. It looks like it is going to be one of the most impressive state-of-the-art factories in Formula One. And that is saying something. F1 factories are always pretty special places to be. But yeah, this one architecturally is pretty impressive as well. Maybe not quite as impressive as McLaren's architecturally, which is stunning. Nate was there earlier this week and it is remarkable. But it's also not that functional, the McLaren one, if you talk to people who actually work there. Whereas this Aston one has been designed around, the people that work there. They've got this thing called the street, which goes down the middle of it, big open hallway. And off that, you've got all the different departments. But because you have this central hallway, they're all actually quite easy to get in between, and they're logically placed with the right people next to each other when they have to talk to each other. Huge design office on the second floor, which is completely open plan, hardly a pillar in there to get in between ideas and conversations. So I'm really keen to go and see what that looks like. So definitely a team to look out for in general, because they made this great start to year. But once they get that factory up and running, operational in every sense, and they bring in the wind tunnel, which I think is still a year and a half away, that's going to be a real force to be reckoned with.
I made a note.
Casey, apparently also has its own either Pret or Costa in the factory, which is pretty amazing. So on top of all that other stuff, you don't even have to drive outside the factory to get your lunch. If that's not a winning mentality, I don't know what is.
That's a man after my own heart, worried about the food source.
Exactly.
I love that.
I don't want to leave.
It is a big issue though. Because I remember Ferrari making this big thing in the mid 2000s about how they insisted all their staff go to lunch and take their time over it and everything. And I think all the teams in the UK were like, yeah, whatever, Italians just doing their thing. But actually every team in the UK has put a lot of effort into their canteens. And also like gyms and things like that. So there's a whole new building which isn't yet finished, being built at Aston Martin alongside this factory I've just described, which is doing the nuts and bolts of it, purely for just employee welfare. And this isn't just about kind of making it a nice place to work. It's also about attracting employees from other teams. Because if you're, we think of engineers who go traveling around the world the whole time, traveling with F1, and that's one thing. But a lot of the guys that make the cars super fast are the guys that spend all day, pretty much every day in the factory, working away, slaving away. And a lot of these factories are not in the most amazing parts of the UK, or a lot of them in industrial estates. And so it is important that you have this environment that is conducive to working, sharing ideas, like I say, but also just a nice place to be. And under the cost cap, where increasingly you can't just throw big numbers at people to come and work for you, having other ways of enticing them in is pretty important.
Gives you a nice mental break, right? If you're able to go to the gym, you're able to go get a nice meal. The sustainability from working so long, as hard as they do, I have to believe is a big upside for a lot of these employees looking for potentially a new employer, as you say. I made a note, so we will get our full recap from you after your site tour on Thursday night next week on Unlapped. So I'll be very, very keen to hear what you learned from your experience. Prediction time, as always, as it stands with our new point format. Thank you to Zach, one of our producers on the show. Laurence, after Austria, you remain at the top at 23 points. Nate, nice moves, got the most points on the weekend with 4. You moved to 16 points, stay in second.
Nice.
iTrail, bring up the rear end at 13 points. Let's go with Nate for your predictions for Silverstone.
I always hate being first because I like to see who
I know, but you haven't been around often as of late, and Laurence has had to do that. So it's finally your turn.
Very fair. I mean, I'm gonna stick with Max P1. I think Lewis at Silverstone is just a different level. He finds something in himself. I'm gonna put him second, and then third, I think Perez. I think that Perez, he has to be finishing on the podium at this point. So yeah, those have been my 3. That might have been. I think I've always done. I've become very aware of. I'm doing a variation of that every week. Max first, Perez third, and then somebody slotting in the middle. But the Nate special hasn't worked yet. But maybe this week is the one.
You did pretty well last week, so we'll take it. Laurence, how do you feel?
Okay, I'm going to make the most of my lead and gamble a bit. So I'm going to go Lewis Hamilton wins the British Grand Prix on nice soil. Sergio Perez is second, and George Russell is third. So 2 Brits on the podium. And something happens to Max. I don't know what yet. Like we keep saying, can he win all the races this year? Probably not, because something's going to go wrong at some point. So I'm going to say it's here at Silverstone, but I don't know what. I'm just trying to make this interesting as well. Before Max fans,
I'm just trying to win. I'm just trying to win this thing now. So
that's how I started. Now I've got a lead.
Also, what an elitist mindset. I've got points to play with, so I'm just going to go out on the
Casey,
limb.
We can't let this stand.
Yeah.
Come on,
no,
we got to reel this guy in. This is outrageous.
You were realistic with yours. I'll be realistic with mine. I'm going to go with Max, Charles, and then I'm going to go with Lewis in third.
Nice. A lot of love for Lewis this week.
I know. Is that just because we're a bit nostalgic and we want to see him do well at Silverstone? I feel like that's part of the reason.
He's won is it 7 times, which is, I think if he wins there one more time, it's a record of any driver at a single circuit, the amount of times they've won. So, there's good reason to pick Lewis.
And I think as well, sometimes I'm skeptical when people say, at this circuit, the crowd lifts me. But Lewis is one of those rare talents where you actually know that is the case. He comes into a Silverstone weekend very fired up, and the whole place is always just so for him. So I think it's a good call. But I mean, maybe George will listen to this and be like, well, I want to be the Brit on the podium. I want to be the Brit in the Nate special sandwich. And he'll outdrive his teammate.
That's what they want. That's what they're all gonna want.
That's what they all want. Forget all this winning a race, whatever. They want to be second between the 2 Red Bulls for that prediction.
Too good. As always, thank you both for your analysis. Enjoy the race. Nate, enjoy Bruce Springsteen. I believe you're hitting that concert before going to Silverstone to join Laurence.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, when Laurence was talking about the Aston Martin, I was like, as great as that sounds, it's not as good as seeing Bruce Springsteen in London. So I
agree with that. I can't agree with that.
Where is he playing?
Hyde Park in London. So should be an amazing gig.
Awesome. Well, enjoy that. We'll reconvene next week on Unlapped. Remember, if you're watching us on YouTube, like this video, leave us a comment, and don't forget to subscribe to ESPN for more F1 content. And if you're listening, hit us with a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. Cheers, guys.